Cedar Falls, Iowa, October 2024. The TechNova Center pierced the small-town skyline like a glass dagger, its 40 floors of smart technology gleaming against the autumn horizon. This wasn't just another building, it was a monument to artificial intelligence. Sensors embedded in every wall, algorithms breathing through every corridor. Jake Morrison clutched his battered resume folder that morning, white shirt wrinkled despite his best efforts, brown khakis pressed but showing their age. She stood beside him in the lobby, gray sweater, worn jeans, looking like any other office worker heading to her cubicle. Two strangers stepped into the same elevator. Jake pressed 15. She pressed 12. Neither spoke. The silence sliced between them like a blade. Then the lights flickered. A grinding screech echoed through the shaft. The elevator plunged 3 floors before slamming to a halt at the 8th, throwing them both against the walls. Emergency alarms shrieked. The building's entire power grid had collapsed. Jake had no idea the terrified woman picking herself up from the floor controlled this $3 billion empire. What happened next in that pitch-black metal tomb would force a CEO to choose between saving her company and revealing a secret that could destroy everything. The emergency lighting cast eerie shadows across their faces as Jake steadied himself against the elevator wall. His interview was scheduled for 9:30 a.m. sharp, a maintenance position that would finally put his engineering background to use, even if it meant starting at the bottom again. The woman across from him brushed dust from her sweater with shaking hands, her composure cracking for just a moment before snapping back into place. Outside, Cedar Falls had never seen anything like the TechNova Center, this gleaming testament to progress that had transformed their quiet Iowa farming community overnight. Jake's calloused fingers found the emergency intercom button, pressing it with the practiced confidence of someone who'd spent years fixing things that others couldn't. The silence that followed felt heavier than the tons of concrete and steel suspended above them. He tried again, then a third time, each attempt met with the same electronic void. The woman watched him work, her eyes tracking his movements with an intensity that seemed oddly professional for someone who claimed to be just another office worker heading to her cubicle. The building's smart systems had failed spectacularly. Temperature controls, lighting, even the basic communication networks that connected every floor to the central hub. Jake pulled out his phone, finding no signal bars, just the familiar dead zone that plagued older buildings during power outages. But this wasn't supposed to be an older building. This was the future, wrapped in glass and steel, designed to anticipate problems before they happened. The irony wasn't lost on him as he studied the elevator's control panel, its sophisticated display now nothing more than a dark mirror reflecting their predicament. "I'm Jake," he said finally, his voice cutting through the mechanical hum of the building's backup systems. The woman hesitated, as if weighing whether to trust this stranger with something as simple as her name. "Alex," she replied, her tone carefully neutral, revealing nothing about why she was here or what she did in this technological fortress. Her hands fidgeted with something in her pocket, a nervous habit that seemed at odds with her otherwise composed demeanor. The elevator shuddered slightly, reminding them both that they were suspended 8 floors above the ground in a metal box that had already proven its fallibility. Jake began examining the access panel, his fingers tracing the edges with the familiarity of someone who'd spent countless hours understanding how things worked. Alex watched him with growing curiosity, noting the way he seemed to instinctively know which components to check first, which systems to trust, and which to suspect. This wasn't the casual investigation of a panicked passenger. This was the methodical assessment of someone who understood machinery at a fundamental level. "You seem to know what you're doing," Alex observed, her voice carrying a subtle probing quality that Jake didn't quite catch. He shrugged, popping off the panel cover with practiced ease. 15 years of keeping things running," he replied, not mentioning the MIT degree gathering dust in his apartment, or the patents he'd filed before Sarah got sick, or the career he'd abandoned to become a full-time caregiver and then a full-time single father. Some stories were too heavy for elevator conversations with strangers. The building's emergency systems kicked in with a mechanical wheeze, flooding the shaft with red warning lights that painted everything in shades of danger. Jake's assessment of the situation grew more serious as he studied the electrical systems behind the panel. This wasn't just a simple power outage. The building's neural network, its interconnected web of sensors and processors, had suffered what appeared to be a cascading failure. Every system was talking to every other system, creating feedback loops that were slowly bringing the entire structure to its knees. Alex moved closer, close enough that Jake could smell her perfume, something expensive and subtle that seemed inconsistent with her carefully casual appearance. "How bad is it?" she asked, and Jake noticed that her question carried the weight of someone who understood that the answer might affect more than just their immediate situation. He was quiet for a long moment, his hands still working inside the panel, before responding with the kind of honesty that crisis situations demanded. "Bad," he said simply, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd seen complex systems fail before. "This isn't just our elevator. The whole building's smart infrastructure is collapsing. Every sensor, every algorithm, every automated system is basically having a nervous breakdown." He paused, studying her face in the emergency lighting. "You work in IT, right? You might understand this better than most people." The way she stiffened at his assumption told him he'd hit something, though he couldn't quite identify what. The hours passed slowly, marked by the occasional groan of the building's structure as it struggled to maintain basic functions without its digital brain. Jake and Alex found themselves sharing the kind of conversation that only happens when people are trapped together, forced to rely on each other for both physical comfort and emotional support. She talked about her work in careful, vague terms that revealed nothing concrete while somehow conveying deep expertise. He spoke about Emma, his 12-year-old daughter, and the way she'd learned to make breakfast for herself on mornings when he had to leave early for job interviews. "She's resilient," Jake said, his voice carrying a mixture of pride and worry that every single parent knows intimately. "Has to be, I suppose. Lost her mom 2 years ago, and now she's got a dad who's trying to figure out how to be both parents while keeping a roof over our heads." Alex listened with the kind of attention that made Jake feel heard, really heard, for the first time in months. There was something in her eyes that suggested she understood loss, understood the weight of carrying responsibilities that felt too big for one person. The conversation revealed layers of both their personalities that neither had expected to share. Alex found herself talking about the isolation of leadership, the way success could create its own kind of loneliness, though she was careful not to reveal exactly what kind of leadership she was describing. Jake spoke about the strange grief of watching his dreams disappear not through failure, but through the simple reality of life requiring different choices than he'd planned to make. They were both running from something, both trying to build something new from the pieces of lives that hadn't turned out as expected. As the morning stretched toward afternoon, Jake's investigation of the building's systems revealed increasingly troubling information. The smart building wasn't just experiencing a power failure, it was suffering from a fundamental design flaw that made it vulnerable to exactly the kind of cascading breakdown they were witnessing. The sensors were too sensitive, the algorithms too interconnected, the fail-safes too dependent on the very systems they were meant to protect. It was an engineering disaster waiting to happen, and it had finally happened. "Whoever designed this system," Jake muttered, his hands deep in the building's digital nervous system, "they were brilliant, but they forgot that complex systems need simple backup plans." Alex moved closer, studying the diagnostic information he'd managed to access through the elevator's maintenance interface. Her questions were sharp, technical, revealing a depth of understanding that seemed inconsistent with her claimed role as a generic IT worker. Jake began to suspect that Alex knew more about this building than she was letting on. The emergency communication system crackled to life suddenly, filling the elevator with the voice of someone who clearly knew both the building and its systems intimately. "This is Marcus Webb, Chief Technology Officer. We're aware of the situation and working to restore power and communications. Please remain calm and await further instructions." Jake's blood ran cold at the voice. Marcus Webb, his former business partner, the man who'd gone on to build the career that Jake had abandoned when Sarah got sick. Alex's reaction was equally telling, though for different reasons. She straightened, her entire demeanor shifting from trapped victim to someone who was clearly used to being in control of situations like this. "Marcus," she said quietly, almost to herself, and Jake caught the familiarity in her voice. The pieces were starting to fit together in ways that made him deeply uncomfortable about exactly who Alex might be and why she was really in this building. "You know Marcus Webb?" Jake asked, his voice carrying a new edge of suspicion. Alex hesitated, clearly weighing how much truth this situation required. "We worked together," she said finally, which was technically accurate while revealing absolutely nothing about the actual nature of their relationship. Jake's mind raced through the possibilities. If Alex worked with Marcus, if she knew enough about the building's systems to ask the right technical questions, if she carried herself with the quiet authority of someone used to being in charge. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The casual clothes, the careful vagueness about her work, The way she'd been studying him throughout their conversation, Alex wasn't just an employee of TechNova. She was someone much more important, someone who had reasons to hide her identity from a maintenance worker she'd met by chance in an elevator. The thought made him feel foolish and angry in equal measure, as if he'd been performing for an audience he didn't know existed. "Who are you really?" Jake asked, his voice carrying the weight of someone who was tired of being lied to. Alex met his gaze steadily, and for the first time since they'd been trapped together, he saw something real in her eyes. Fear, not of their physical situation, but of the moment when pretense would have to give way to truth. The elevator seemed smaller suddenly, the space between them charged with a tension that had nothing to do with their mechanical predicament. The building's communication system crackled again, and this time Marcus's voice carried a note of urgency that penetrated even the elevator's metal walls. "Alexandra, if you can hear this, we need you to know that the system failure is worse than we initially thought. The backup protocols aren't engaging, and we're looking at a potential complete shutdown of all building systems within the next few hours." Jake's world tilted as the name registered. Alexandra, not Alex. Alexandra, who Marcus was addressing directly. Alexandra, who was clearly someone whose input was critical to solving this crisis. Jake stared at the woman who'd been sharing his space for hours, seeing her clearly for the first time. Not Alex the IT worker, but Alexandra, someone important enough that the CTO was broadcasting messages specifically to her, someone whose presence in this building was clearly not coincidental. The careful way she'd been asking questions, the technical expertise she'd displayed, the authority in her voice when she thought he wasn't paying attention, it all made sense now, and the sense it made filled him with a cold anger. "You're not just an employee," Jake said, his voice flat with the realization. "You're someone who makes decisions about this building, about the people who work here, about the systems that are failing right now." Alexandra, looked at him with an expression that mixed regret with something that might have been relief. The pretense was over, and they both knew it. The question now was what would happen next, trapped together in a space that suddenly felt much smaller than it had moments before. The truth hung between them like a blade, sharp and dangerous and impossible to ignore. Alexandra Chen-Williams, CEO of TechNova Corporation, had spent the morning pretending to be someone she wasn't, talking to a man who was exactly who he appeared to be. Jake Morrison, unemployed engineer and single father, had been sharing his hopes and fears with someone who controlled the very systems that had failed them, someone who had the power to hire or ignore him with equal ease. "I wanted to see the building through the eyes of someone who actually had to work here," Alexandra said finally, her voice carrying the weight of an explanation that sounded inadequate even to her own ears. "I wanted to understand what we'd built from the perspective of the people who would depend on it every day." Jake listened to her words, hearing the logic behind them while feeling the sting of deception that colored every moment of their trapped conversation. The elevator shuddered again, a reminder that their personal drama was playing out against the backdrop of a technological disaster that was rapidly growing beyond anyone's ability to control. Jake's analysis of the building's systems had revealed problems that went far beyond simple power failures. The entire concept of the smart building was flawed, vulnerable to exactly the kind of cascading breakdown that was currently destroying $3 billion worth of infrastructure and reputation. "Your building is going to kill people," Jake said bluntly, his engineer's mind cutting through the emotional complexity of their situation to focus on the technical realities. "The fire suppression system is tied to the same network as the climate control, which is connected to the security systems, which depend on the power management protocols. When one fails, they all fail. In a real emergency, your smart building becomes a death trap." Alexandra listened to his assessment with the expression of someone who was beginning to understand the full scope of the disaster she was facing. The weight of responsibility settled on Alexandra's shoulders like a physical burden. Every decision she'd made about this building, every corner cut to meet deadlines, every system integrated to showcase their technological capabilities, it all led to this moment, trapped in an elevator with a man who understood the consequences of her choices better than she did. The building was her vision, her legacy, her proof that technology could improve lives. Instead, it had become a monument to the dangers of complexity without wisdom. Jake's anger gave way to something more complex as he watched Alexandra grapple with the implications of his technical assessment. She wasn't just a distant CEO making decisions from a boardroom. She was someone who genuinely cared about the people who would be affected by the building's failures. The weight of leadership, the isolation of command, the impossible burden of making decisions that would affect thousands of lives. He could see all of it in her expression as she absorbed the reality of what they were facing. "Can you fix it?" Alexandra asked, her voice carrying a vulnerability that her CEO persona had never allowed. Jake looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not the powerful executive who'd been deceiving him, but a person who was as trapped by her circumstances as he was by his. They were both prisoners of the choices they'd made, both struggling to build something meaningful from the pieces of lives that hadn't turned out as planned. The emergency lighting flickered, reminding them that time was running out. Jake's assessment of the building's systems had revealed a possible solution, but it would require someone with deep technical knowledge to implement, someone who understood both the building's design and the fundamental principles of system engineering. It would also require trust between two people who'd spent the morning lying to each other, cooperation between a CEO and a maintenance worker who occupied completely different worlds. "I think I can," Jake said finally, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who'd spent years solving problems that others couldn't. "But I'll need access to the building's core systems, and I'll need someone who can authorize the kind of changes that might save this place." He paused, studying her face in the emergency lighting. "I'll need someone who's willing to trust an unemployed single father with $3 billion worth of technology." Alexandra looked at Jake with new eyes, seeing not just the maintenance worker she'd been deceiving, but the engineer he'd been, the problem solver he still was, the man who might be able to save everything she'd built. The irony wasn't lost on her. The solution to her technological disaster might come from someone she'd met by pure chance, someone who had every reason to walk away from her problems and never look back. The building's systems groaned around them, a mechanical symphony of failure that underscored the urgency of their situation. Jake's hands moved with practiced efficiency as he began the delicate work of reprogramming the building's core systems, essentially performing emergency surgery on a patient that was dying from technological complexity. Alexandra watched him work, seeing the concentration and skill that had been hidden beneath his humble exterior, recognizing the kind of talent that her company desperately needed. "Why did you leave engineering?" Alexandra asked as Jake worked, her voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than the careful probing of their earlier conversation. Jake's hands didn't stop moving, but his voice carried a weight of memory and loss that made her understand why some questions were harder to answer than others. "My wife got sick," he said simply. "Cancer. Someone had to take care of her, and then someone had to take care of Emma. Engineering became something I used to do, not something I was." The simple honesty of his answer hit Alexandra harder than any business presentation or technical report ever had. Here was someone who'd given up everything for love, who'd sacrificed his career for his family, who'd chosen human connection over professional success. It was a kind of bravery that her world rarely acknowledged, a form of strength that couldn't be measured in stock prices or quarterly reports. As Jake worked deeper into the building's systems, his assessment of the problems became increasingly grim. The smart building's interconnected design meant that fixing one system often destabilized others, creating a cascade of new problems that required increasingly complex solutions. It was like trying to repair a spider web while the spider was still spinning. Every thread touched every other thread, and disturbing one could collapse the entire structure. "The building's learning algorithms are stuck in a feedback loop," Jake explained as he worked, his voice carrying the patient tone of someone used to explaining complex technical concepts to non-technical people. "Every sensor is reporting anomalies, and the system is trying to respond to all of them simultaneously. It's like trying to have a conversation with 1,000 people at once. Eventually, you just start screaming." Alexandra listened to his explanation, beginning to understand not just the technical problems, but the philosophical ones that had led to this crisis. The hours passed in intense concentration as Jake systematically worked through the building's systems, identifying critical failures and implementing temporary fixes that might buy them enough time to escape. Alexandra found herself serving as his assistant, following his instructions with the kind of precision that revealed her own technical background. They worked together with the efficiency of people who understood both the urgency of their situation and the complexity of the solutions required. "There," Jake said finally, his voice carrying exhaustion and relief in equal measure. "The elevators should be operational again, at least temporarily. The building's other systems are still compromised, but we should be able to get out of here." Alexandra looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and something deeper, recognition of the kind of competence and dedication that her company needed if it was going to survive this crisis and prevent others like it. The elevator lurched back to life with a mechanical sigh, its lights flickering on as the building's systems reluctantly accepted Jake's emergency repairs. Alexandra reached for the control panel, then stopped, her hand hovering over the buttons as she realized that opening the doors would end this strange interlude, returning them to their separate worlds where she was a CEO and he was an unemployed maintenance worker. "Jake," she said, her voice carrying a formality that hadn't been present during their hours of crisis cooperation. "TechNova needs someone with your skills. The building needs someone who understands both technology and its human implications. I'm offering you a position as Chief Engineering Officer, reporting directly to me." Jake looked at her with an expression that mixed surprise with something that might have been suspicion. "Why?" he asked, his voice carrying the wariness of someone who'd been disappointed by promises before. "Because I fixed your elevator? Because I happened to be in the right place at the right time? Or because you feel guilty about lying to me for the past 6 hours?" Alexandra met his gaze steadily, recognizing the validity of his questions, while knowing that her answer would determine whether this crisis became a catastrophe or a catalyst for positive change. "Because you saw problems that my entire engineering team missed," Alexandra replied, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd learned something important about leadership during their time trapped together. "Because you understood that technology serves people, not the other way around. Because you made decisions based on what was right rather than what was expedient." She paused, studying his face in the elevator's restored lighting. "And because Emma deserves a father who gets to use his gifts to build something meaningful." Jake was quiet for a long moment, his mind processing not just the job offer, but everything that had led to this moment. The career he'd abandoned, the choices he'd made, the woman who'd shared his crisis, and emerged as someone who might understand both his capabilities and his priorities. The elevator waited patiently, its doors closed, giving them time to navigate this transition from crisis to possibility. "I accept," Jake said finally, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who'd found his way back to purpose. "But I have conditions. I work reasonable hours because I have a daughter who needs me. I make decisions based on safety and functionality, not just innovation. And if you ever lie to me again about who you are or what you need, I walk away." Alexandra smiled, recognizing the terms of someone who understood both his worth and his priorities. The elevator doors opened onto a world that looked the same but felt completely different. The lobby of the TechNova Center buzzed with activity as emergency crews worked to assess and repair the damage from the building's spectacular failure. Jake and Alexandra stepped out together, two people who'd been changed by their shared crisis, who'd found in each other exactly what they'd been looking for without knowing they were looking for it. Marcus Webb rushed toward them, his face showing the strain of someone who'd been managing a technological disaster while worrying about his CEO trapped in an elevator. "Alexandra, thank God you're safe," he said, his voice carrying genuine relief. "Jake," he added, his tone shifting to surprise as he recognized his former business partner. "What are you doing here?" The question hung in the air as three people who'd shared a professional past found themselves navigating a very different present. "Jake is our new Chief Engineering Officer," Alexandra said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd made a decision that wouldn't be questioned. "He's the one who got us out of the elevator and identified the systemic problems that caused today's failures. He starts immediately." Marcus looked between them, clearly processing the implications of hiring someone with Jake's background and capabilities, someone who understood both the technical challenges and the human stakes of their work. The weeks that followed were a blur of technical assessments, system redesigns, and the kind of intensive collaboration that happens when smart people work together to solve complex problems. Jake threw himself into the work with the passion of someone who'd found his way back to purpose, while Alexandra discovered that having an engineer who prioritized human needs over technological showcases made her company stronger, not weaker. Emma adjusted to her father's new job with the resilience that had carried her through loss and uncertainty. She liked Alexandra, who visited their small apartment with the kind of genuine interest that couldn't be faked, who understood that being important in the business world didn't make someone important in a 12-year-old's life, unless they proved it through actions rather than titles. The TechNova Center reopened 6 months later, its smart systems redesigned with the kind of elegant simplicity that Jake had learned to value during his years of fixing things that were broken. The building was still innovative, still impressive, but now it was also reliable, safe, and designed to serve the people who worked there, rather than showcasing the cleverness of its creators. On a quiet Tuesday morning, Jake and Alexandra found themselves alone in the same elevator where they'd first met, heading to different floors for different meetings. The silence between them was comfortable now, filled with the kind of understanding that develops between people who've shared crisis and emerged as partners in building something better. "Thank you," Alexandra said as the elevator approached her floor, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd learned that the best business decisions are often the most human ones. Jake smiled, recognizing in her words not just gratitude for his technical skills, but acknowledgement of the journey they'd taken together from strangers to colleagues to something more complex and valuable. The elevator doors opened, and Alexandra stepped out into a world that looked the same but worked better because two people had been willing to trust each other with their vulnerabilities, their expertise, and their hope that technology could serve humanity rather than the other way around. Jake continued to his floor, carrying with him the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd found his way back to purpose through the most unexpected of circumstances. In the months that followed, the TechNova Center became a model for how smart buildings could be designed to prioritize human needs without sacrificing technological innovation. Jake's engineering philosophy, that complex systems need simple backup plans, that technology should serve people rather than impress them, became the foundation for a new approach to building design that other companies began to emulate. The story of their elevator encounter became something of a legend within TechNova, though the details were known only to a few people. It was a reminder that the best solutions often come from the most unexpected sources, that crisis can create opportunities for connection and growth, and that the most important innovations are often the ones that make technology more human rather than more complex. Emma started high school that fall, proud of her father's work and comfortable with the changes that success had brought to their lives. She'd learned to trust Alexandra's presence in their world, recognizing in her someone who understood that being part of their family meant showing up consistently and caring about the small things that mattered to a teenager navigating the complexities of growing up. The building stood as a testament to what was possible when technology was designed with wisdom rather than just ambition, when the people who created systems understood that their ultimate purpose was to serve the humans who depended on them. Jake's engineering philosophy had become the foundation for a new way of thinking about innovation, one that prioritized reliability and human needs over flashy features and complex capabilities. As Jake looked up at the TechNova Center each morning, he saw not just a building, but a symbol of second chances, of the possibility that life could surprise you with opportunities to become who you were meant to be. The elevator that had trapped them had also freed them both, Alexandra from the isolation of leadership without connection, Jake from the limitation of talent without opportunity. The simple truth was that they'd found in each other exactly what they'd been looking for without knowing they were looking for it. Not romance, though that might come in time, but partnership, the kind of collaboration that makes both people better than they could be alone. They discovered that the best solutions to complex problems often require both technical expertise and human wisdom, that innovation serves its highest purpose when it makes life better for the people who depend on it. Years later, when Jake was recognized as one of the most innovative engineers in the country, when the TechNova Center had become a model for buildings around the world, when Emma had graduated from college and started her own career in sustainable technology, he would still remember that morning in the elevator as the moment when everything changed. Not because of what they'd fixed, but because of what they'd discovered about themselves and each other when they were forced to strip away pretense and work together on something that mattered more than their individual fears and ambitions. The elevator doors opened and closed thousands of times each day, carrying people between floors, between meetings, between the moments that made up their working lives. But for two people, it had been something more. A catalyst for transformation, a space where crisis became opportunity, where strangers became partners in building something better than either could have imagined alone. That was the real story of the TechNova Center, not the technology it housed, but the human connections it had made possible, the proof that the most important innovations happen not in laboratories or boardrooms, but in the spaces where people choose to trust each other with their hopes, their fears, and their dreams of what might be possible if they were brave enough to try.